So I figured you can start us off with a really nice introduction, who you are and really what you do. And then we'll dive into some questions so that dancers can learn a little bit more about, your role in sustainable cross training.
Of course. So I'm Delaney. I am a personal trainer for dancers. So mostly with dancers, I work on correcting muscle imbalances, preventing some injuries, and of course, reaching towards their goals of, let's say, turns, flexibility, just higher leaps, anything like that. So like most dancers, I grew up at a local studio down the block. And once I started to get really serious, it was great that I lived so close to New York. I live right on Long Island, outside of New York City. So once I decided I wanted to take it a little bit more seriously, it was really great being able to get outside the studio a little bit, go into the city, experience that type of like pre-professional kind of life. And then I auditioned for colleges. I ended up going to Marymount Manhattan College. I was a dance major, BFA, in modern and ballet. And then, of course, that was during COVID, so fun times. And when I was home doing my studies, I ended up doing a personal training certification just because I had always loved fitness. And throughout my dance career at that point, I had many injuries, let's say. So I was really passionate about helping other dancers prevent some of those injuries that could have been prevented for me. So from there, I just started working with some dancers at the studio I had grown up at. And it just kind of blossomed from there.
Yeah.
And now I do some freelance work throughout the city, but this is my main priority.
Absolutely. And I definitely can relate in regards to starting at a smaller school, luckily having that access to New York City from a very young age and being able to test those waters from before college to my college years. And then, of course, I shifted gears and went into the world of nutrition, but similar to you with that overall goal of wanting to support dancers, because from my perspective in regards to nutrition, obviously the foods that we choose each and every day and how we fuel our body and most importantly, our relationship with food really does help with long-term performance, which a lot of dancers don't necessarily think about, especially our younger dancers. They don't necessarily think about the long-term, right? It's that mindset of needing to push through injury, and really just doing whatever it takes to necessarily get through one audition or tomorrow's performance and so forth without thinking about the long-term repercussions if they're not choosing other habitual behaviors, whether it's like how they're fueling their body or how they're cross-training, to really support the long term. So my next question for you is, why is cross-training so important? You had already mentioned that it's going to help with balance, flexibility, and strength. Can you expand a little bit on this for us?
Yeah, of course. I like to say that dancers are athletes. It's not just what everyone thinks dance is. We're doing, especially now, we're having these young kids doing these crazy, crazy tricks and skills that probably most of us wouldn't have even been able to do at one point in our life. And we're expecting so much of them, requiring our muscles to do so much work. So the fact that we aren't also strengthening them the way any other athlete would kind of blows my mind. And it's crazy how that's just becoming a bigger thing. So one, just because we're athletes, we need to train like them as well. And then also preventing those overuse injuries. I see a lot of times dancers coming from studios and they're like, yep, I've only ever trained on one side. So that left side has so many muscle imbalances where sometimes we're just working on that left side to kind of make the body a little bit more even so that they can reach their goals that way. And then also just preventing the frustration. I see a lot of times, especially with turns, I know this is a lot, where when they're trying to get better at their turns, it turns into just practicing turns. But a lot of times, if the right muscles aren't doing what they need to do, those turns are never going to happen. We're always going to fall back into those bad habits. And then that leads to the frustration and getting upset and kind of that negative self-talk. So if we can kind of take a step away from the actual skill, strengthen the muscles that we need on their own, so that when we do go back to the skill, it's kind of like putting a puzzle piece back together. Everything just comes together, and I love seeing their eyes light up. It's crazy. But everything just kind of fits all together, and they're like, wait, we weren't working on that, but it all goes into play.
Yeah, and another factor that plays into this, especially for dancers, is just their vulnerability to perfectionism. I know from personal experience just the proactive approach I have to take in taking that step back, because it's so easy to really hyperfixate on wanting to execute one move. And then, of course, if you have that vulnerability to perfectionism, it just is exacerbated. And like you said, it's so funny because it turns, even for myself, like as we're talking about this, I'm identifying in my own personal like dance training that turns happen to be one of those movements that can be so easy for us to fixate on and think the more I do, the better I become. And it's simply not the case, right? Sometimes really taking ourselves out of that perspective and asking ourselves, okay, well, what else is going on in the turn that I can start to work on to hopefully help?
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's so important to hear, and also important for dancers to know that your role as a trainer is to do exactly that, right? It's not just to arbitrarily cross train, but it's also to, what it sounds like, maybe you have a better phrase for this, but like pinpoint certain areas within a dancer's technique that you're working on.
Yeah, exactly. I had an interesting conversation with a dancer earlier this week, and she's actually working on turns, but through one of our other exercises, I asked her, I was like, when you do an arabesque, what are you feeling in your body? I wanted to hear that from her. And she is very flexible, this lovely dancer. And she kind of told me that she likes to rely on that back flexibility and her flexibility. So that kind of opened a whole other window of, well, I definitely see that because maybe your glutes are a little bit weak and we need to strengthen that. And that would, yes, it's going to help your turns, but it's also going to help these other areas too. So we're not just focusing on one thing with cross training. We might have that goal in mind, but in reality, it's going to help all these other areas as well.
Absolutely. I love that. It really does expand upon so many different aspects of a dancer's training. So what is, in your opinion, an ideal amount of time that you like to see dancers cross-train? Remembering that dancers are vulnerable to those perfectionistic behaviors.
Yes. So I hate to say it, but it really depends on the dancer. A lot of times, these dancers are at their studios pretty much 7 days a week for multiple hours a night. So in that case, we also want to take into account, we need time to rest.
Yeah.
So it is finding that good balance of studio time, how much extra time you have, but also having time to be a human as well. I always like to emphasize that part too. So let's say like not really competition season, because competition season gets a little crazy this time of year.
Yeah.
I always recommend about 2 to 3 times a week. Almost the same as if you were going to PT. They're going to give you your exercises. They're going to tell you them to do about 2 to 3 times a week. If you want to see those muscles gaining strength properly, but also having the adequate amount of time to rest, 2 to 3 times is usually golden for the most part.
Yeah, that's super helpful. That's really giving our viewers a very actionable approach. It's not too general, which is nice. And it's also not too specific, which does help to apply to all dancers. So I think, hearing that 2 to 3 times a week, but also considering, what is accessible to dancers in regards to time. Competition season might not be the most accessible time to, dive into a new cross-training routine. And really thinking about a dancer's year as a whole, and thinking about, I have this too in regards to with nutrition, and thinking about, okay, well, the role of food during summer intensive season, the role of food in preparing for summer intensive season, so that we don't see the onset of stress fractures in August, because all of that cycles and really comes together. So I love that aspect of this, which is really considering accessibility, and the different seasons within a dancer's training throughout the year. So that's super important. So in regards to strength, flexibility, and endurance, unless I'm missing any, and you can tell me because you're the expert in it, not me, but those seem to be 3 very important pillars for a dancer when it comes to building their cross training routine or working on their cross-training efforts. Do you prioritize any over the other, or are they all equally important? So how would you suggest dancers start to think about this and these three different pillars, unless there's more that I'm not thinking of?
No, those are good. Those three pillars are good organization. I like to think that they're all pretty equal. But again, it's almost a little bit based on the dancer and their situation. Personally, with the dancers I work with, the trend I've seen is that a lot of them are super flexible, and that's all they've ever really worked on.
Yeah.
So we might work on flexibility a little bit, but a lot of times we're working more on that strength portion of it for them. With other dancers, it might be that we really are working on flexibility because other factors are coming into play that is making their current flexibility training not very successful. And there are so many different things with flexibility, like nerves, muscle length, all that type of stuff that comes into play. But I'd say generally you kind of want to do a little bit with all. You never want to neglect that flexibility aspect, especially dynamic flexibility, being able to put our muscle in this elongated position, but be able to control it there as well.
Oh, that's super interesting.
And then also keeping that strength portion so that we can do all these skills and we can continue our dancing and preventing those injuries. So most of the time, I've been seeing strength has been a little bit more of a priority, but I would say really depending on the dancer. So for dancers kind of just jumping into cross-training and figuring out a schedule on their own, I would definitely say to look at what they're currently doing. And most of the time that incorporates a lot of flexibility and just trying to see where the other things can fit in within their current training.
Yeah.
That's not too specific.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I agree. I think that most dancers tend to either have the flexibility portion or have that naturally built into their dance classes and their dance routine. And most often, I know for myself, I know from dancers I've worked with, obviously in just the nutrition realm, and having them report to me that their strength or their are what we tend to see needing the most attention in regards to cross training, and also just the role that food plays in that as well, right? I'll have dancers who are reporting a ton of fatigue by the time they even get to Petit Allegro, and we consider, okay, well, what is your snack plan? What are some of the options that you're choosing? How can we really sustain your energy for longer? And I think that the cross training routine fits literally like a puzzle into this in regards to trying as best as we can to sustain performance, and as I mentioned earlier, in a way that's not promoting injury. And you mentioned dynamic flexibility. I think that's something that's incredibly important for dancers to hear a little bit more about, because again, as you know, you see those younger dancers who will kind of just like flop into their splits or throw their leg up. I was definitely that dancer when I was younger. Always had that natural flexibility, and the strength portion came later. So I do want to hear from you a little bit more about dynamic flexibility and really what that means to not just exemplify flexibility, but to be able to do so in a way that's controlled.
Exactly. Yep. So dynamic flexibility is a little bit, I like to incorporate it part of a warm-up routine rather than just kind of coming into the studio, jumping into a split, jumping into a lunge, and just trying to hold it there. That's a static stretch. We're not moving. We're not working our muscles at all. Where dynamic stretch is basically using your own muscle to provide resistance to stretch another muscle. So basically flexing a muscle opposite the muscle you're trying to target. So that could be laying down with one leg up towards the ceiling and lifting and lowering the opposite leg, trying to stretch that hamstring by making it contract and elongate and also stabilize in that position. So with that, we are increasing our flexibility and then also finding the strength within it and the control rather than just getting our leg up and holding it there and wishing for the best, because that's not going to help us when we stand up to try to do extensions or leaps or anything like that.
And then finally, what would you say to a dancer who has not yet really dived into the world of cross training, wants to begin, but doesn't know where to start? So I want for you to also include how they can even start and access your resources. But then in general, what do you recommend in regards to starting this thing that could be so new and a challenge to get into an already busy schedule where we have dance and academics at the same time.
Right, exactly. So I like to say, and I do this for my dancers who I've been working with for a while, I always say it can get a little bit crazy when you have all these different exercises you're seeing, or maybe you know of, and you think you have to do every single one of them. And you're then overwhelmed, and sometimes you lose motivation. You're like, I don't have time for this. It's not going to work. So what I like to say is find 3 or 4 or even 2 or 3 exercises that are going to target all of your goals. Whether you need to gain glute strength, whether you want to improve your extensions. Find like 3 to 4 exercises that are going to help you reach your goals and focus on that to start. Because those are going to find all your different pieces and they're going to put them together without having to find 10 million different exercises to do and then getting overwhelmed. Because a lot of us don't have time for that. And that's why we don't do it. Where 3 to 4 could take 15, 20 minutes at night or after school before you head to the studio. So I would say, number 1, try to figure out like, oh, maybe I need to gain strength here, here, and here. Usually core is a big one. I would always start out with. So find 3 to 4 exercises that you want to focus on just at the beginning and do that. And sometimes you do need the help to figure out what those 3 or 4 exercises should be or the areas they should be targeting. So that's where I come into play or other people like me. So that would be number 1 for sure. And number 2, I'd say, and starting anything new, just listen to your body. We, of course, want to be consistent with what we're doing and find a consistent schedule, but also we need time to take a break. If your body's not used to what you're doing and now you're adding more on top of it, it's going to fatigue a lot faster. So just kind of knowing that, yes, I do need to do my cross training today because that's what I'm set to do, but maybe my body needs a break today, and that's totally okay.
Fabulous. Well, this was so wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me, and we will be in touch. We'll talk soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Have a good evening.
You too.